Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Boston and Balling. I'm your host, Gabby Hurlbut. Hope everybody's having a fantastic week. The weather seems to have turned itself around a little bit here. I know where I am, it's starting to get pretty hot and summery. So hopefully people can start to get some beach days in and really start to enjoy the summer, especially now that we're almost halfway through the baseball season already, which is kind of crazy. So happy summer to all of you and happy early Father's Day as well to all the amazing dads out there, mine included. He's the best, and I love him very much. So, Dad, if you're listening to the show, always appreciate everything that you do for me. And I hope you have a wonderful Father's Day weekend, and everybody else does as well. With that, I am excited to bring you another episode of the show. Today, I do have a guest with me on this episode that I'm excited to introduce here too. He is a reporter for Celtics Blog, and he also has his own Celtics podcast that he hosts. So very, very much in the NBA space. Jack Simone, how are you doing?
I'm good. I'm good. Thank you for the intro. That was one of the best intros I've gotten. I usually just get it. Yeah, this is Jack. He's over here. So I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. I try. I really try. It's good for people to, get the credit they deserve for what they're doing. So I definitely try to let people know, this is why this person is a good guest for me to have.
I appreciate that. A lot of people pronounce my last name wrong too, but you got it right, so I'm impressed. You'd be surprised.
Really? Yeah. I've always been actually relatively good with pronouncing names. I don't know why, but it's funny because a lot of people have said that to me before, like, oh, people usually pronounce my name
Yeah.
wrong. We didn't. So I'm glad we're off to a good start here.
Yes, very good.
Well, I do appreciate you coming on my show. I definitely want to talk some Celtics with you and kind of, how the season ended and the off season. But first, I want to hear a little bit more about you and how you kind of got involved with working in the NBA space.
Yeah, so I guess it was kind of unconventional. I went into college not really knowing what I wanted to do. I think I was a nursing major to start, and then I went to education, and then I finished with a history degree because I like just wanted to graduate on time, and I was going to be a history teacher. So I was just like, at this point, just like, get me out, and I'll figure it out. And so my junior year of college, I started my own blog. It was called like Bannertown USA. I don't write there anymore because I just don't have time. But I wrote about the Celtics and I sort of like started practicing writing. And then throughout the years, I was like, okay, maybe I kind of want to do this full time. So I graduated with my history degree. I got a master's in communication and sports, and then I just started applying places. I wrote for Fansided, Hardwood Houdini, which is Celtics. Then I started writing for some other places, and I sort of just kind of worked my way up, applying here, there, and everywhere. And now I'm at, like you said, Celtics Blog. I write for USA Today's Bulls site, and then I do work for Fansided still as well. So just kind of the process of writing as much as I can and applying anywhere I can until I get wherever I'm going.
Yeah, no, it really is one of those things too. Being in this type of industry, you really have to be open to a lot of different possibilities and kind of be open to just applying to,
Mhm.
whatever, and then getting your foot in the door somewhere because once you start to get the experience, the more better off you are in terms of the future and getting other jobs in the industry after that. So it really is about at the beginning just kind of applying everywhere and seeing what happens and being willing to take something to get that experience.
Absolutely, and sometimes I regret not going to school for journalism or something like that. But I truly think like the more stuff you do, kind of makes up for the degree or anything. So I'm glad I took the route I took.
Yeah, it's a lot more about the experience you're
Mhm.
getting, whether in college from internships or after you graduate and just getting involved in stuff because that experience is really what, matters when you're looking for jobs in the industry.
Definitely, yeah, I couldn't agree more.
That's awesome. Good for you. I'm really
Thank
happy
you.
that you're involved with something that you're so passionate about. And obviously you love basketball and you love the Celtics. So being able to wake up every day and cover something that you absolutely love is just rewarding in itself.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. I very thankful that I'm doing this and not being a nurse or a teacher. Not that those are bad professions, just not for me personally.
Yeah, no, yeah, I understand for sure. You want to find your passion and everybody's is different.
Exactly.
But yeah, speaking of the Celtics, I did want to get your input because obviously, they had a really good regular season and going into the postseason, a lot of us had high hopes in terms of what they would be doing, how far they'd go, hopefully going back to the finals like they were last year and really kind of carrying that momentum from that finals loss last year into this postseason. And then, they struggled in the playoffs. I mean, especially against Philly, we started to see a lot of the inconsistencies come through that we had seen for a lot of the regular season. And then even I'd say even a little bit in the Atlanta series, they showed some of their inconsistencies too. And then they ran into a Heat team that I said before that series, if they can't be consistent, they're going to have a hard time with that team because obviously Spoelstra is a great coach and Miami is really good at doing things like forcing turnovers, which we know the Celtics are very, very prone to committing turnovers. And so obviously, went down 0-3, like we all thought that the series was over, and then they come back, they win 3 straight games, and I really had a good feeling about them being able to close out the series at home in game 7. And then they come out for game 7 and it was just a pretty embarrassing performance in that game and definitely disappointing. So I did want to kind of get your thoughts on kind of what you think went wrong overall, primarily in the playoffs for the Celtics, and why they were unable to reach that goal of kind of taking care of business and finishing the job this year.
Yeah, I think it was different things throughout different points in the playoffs, which is an issue in and of itself because I think it all goes back to consistency and being able to play at their best for the entire postseason, which they just couldn't do. I think the defense against Philly and against Atlanta was the real problem. They didn't necessarily shoot amazing, but they shot well enough where if they had just defended well, they probably would have won in 5 or 6 games against Philly and probably could have been a sweep against Atlanta if they played at their best, honestly. And then once you get to Miami, the defense kind of turned around a little bit in those last 4 games at the very least. They couldn't make a shot. They shot below 30% from 3 4 times in one series for a team that averaged, almost 38% from 3 regular season. And Miami shot ridiculously well from 3. So it was like,
So
as much as you
ridiculous.
want to look at the numbers and say, oh, Miami just got hot, like the Celtics just couldn't make anything. And then you go back to the issue of effort as well, and that's also a problem that the Celtics team has dealt with for the past X amount of seasons, right? You look at them play, and on one night they're the best team in the world, the ball's moving, they're hitting shots, but as soon as the 3-point shot stops dropping, their effort levels on defense go down, and then their effort levels on offense go down. They just choose to play isolation basketball, and I don't know if that's something that coaching can fix. You sort of saw it last year a little bit, but even then, like they went up X amount of games in the finals, or they had a chance to go up 3-1 and then they blew it. So it's not like these problems are new to Joe Mazzulla and his staff. They've been going on for 3 straight head coaches now. And that's, I think, what ultimately did them in. It's not only their poor shooting and poor defensive efforts, it's their ability to not bring the energy in the other areas when one thing isn't working. And so if one thing's not working, the whole team falls apart. And that's the real problem. And I think that's what teams like the Nuggets, like the Heat, they do a really good job of staying consistent in all other areas when one thing's not working. Because whether it be coaching or just the team chemistry or team mentality, like they're able to push through all their struggles rather than crumble at the first sign of weakness.
Yep. And I think, you hit the nail on the head with the word consistency. That's something that we've seen be an issue for a long time. And it really ultimately caught up with them at the end. And you look at the Celtics versus the Heat on paper, and the Celtics talent wise should have been able to win that series and go back to the finals. And I honestly felt like if you're just looking at pure talent, the Celtics should have been able to win that series in 5 or 6 games. And
Agree. Yeah.
then, you take the coaching aspect of it, and obviously, Spoelstra is a fantastic coach, and I give the guy a lot of credit because especially in postseason play, he always has that team prepared and he knows how to make adjustments game to game, which we did see, and in-game adjustments, and he just coaches really well. So that's why I said we can't count this Heat team out, because I do think they'll give the Celtics a run for their money. But ultimately, I thought that Boston would close out the series in 6 games. And I think, that word consistency kept popping into my head in terms of this team came out some days and looked like they could beat anybody. Like that game 7 against Philly, I really thought was going to be the turning point where they just kind of, the rest of the playoffs were just, in full force, like playing their best basketball every game. And that team and Tatum going off in that game, I was like, it's really hard to beat this team when they're playing their best. I don't really see anybody beating them when they're at their best. But then they'd come out other nights and they look like a team that, could lose to anybody too. And it was just really, really weird just how quickly that switch got flipped night to night. And I think ultimately by the time they played Miami, it just caught up to them too much. And it was just really unfortunate, just the little mistakes they were making and not being able to lock in defensively, like you said. And then when they started to fix the defense, nobody was making shots. And it just was one thing would go right, but another thing would go wrong. And Miami just played better all around basketball in the series.
Yeah, definitely. We were saying something similar on our podcast. My co-host Sam and I were like, the Celtics heading in at least, and even after the first couple games, like the Celtics have the more talented team on paper. And one of our shows found like Heat YouTube or whatever, so there were a lot of Heat fans coming to listen, and they were all like, "How can you say that when they're losing?" It's like, well, I mean, just look at the regular season. Like you see the talent difference there. The big issue is the Celtics' best opponent is themselves because they consistently beat up on themselves. They consistently make these mistakes. They turn the ball over. They don't bring it on offense. They play isolation. They can't play defense because of effort levels. And so when they're consistently beating themselves, they are a solid title contending team. And that can lose to any other team in the playoffs. But when they're at their best, like you said, they truly can contend with anybody. It's just, if they're not going to do that consistently, then like the conversation is a moot point because they're just not going to come to play.
No, it's so true. And I mean, I'm happy for the Nuggets. I mean, good for that city and good for that team for, winning their first ever title. And Jokic to me is such a likable player and it's just fun to watch him play and even his supporting cast. There's just a lot of talent on that team. So I'm definitely really happy for them. But it was disappointing watching that finals and being like, this is just not even that competitive of a finals. Like they just showed that they were a vastly better team than Miami. And it was just such just a mismatch of teams. And I think if the Celtics had been there, they would have been able to give Denver a harder time. And I think it would have been a genuinely more competitive series. And I did see a stat about how viewership wise the numbers dropped for this finals, and I think simply that was because of the teams that were in the finals, and it just didn't have as much interest. And Miami going into that series, obviously they had this Cinderella run being an 8 seed and going all the way to the finals, which obviously very rarely happens. And then they go and they play a good Nuggets team who's kind of been dominant the whole playoffs and was never behind in a series, which must have been nice. Their fans didn't have to stress out like we did as much. So for them, it was just a complete mismatch to me. It just didn't, the games weren't really that competitive. And it was just kind of the Nuggets dominating for the majority of the time. And so it is a little upsetting thinking about the fact that that could have been the Celtics. And I truly think if the Celtics were playing their best basketball, that they could beat Denver too.
I think at their best, they would have had a chance against Denver. I just go back to, I actually wrote about it, excuse me, for Celtics blog, talking about like, would the Celtics have had a chance? And I think the best version of the Celtics would have had a chance. I just think the version we saw against the Heat might have run into Jokic and Jamal Murray being like the best duo in the past 5 years. Like if the Celtics brought the same level of play, like say they had a miracle win in game 7, or they managed to pull it out, as my dog's barking in the background, I apologize. Say they won game 7, right? And they continued to play at that level where it's like, okay, one night they're really good, next night they're not good. I think the Nuggets would have stomped them just because the Nuggets were relentlessly consistent and they played the same high level of basketball the whole time. If the Celtics turned it around and their 3-point shot got back on track and they played with effort on defense, like, yeah, I think it would have been a very competitive series, but it's tough to gauge this team. And I think that's the really frustrating part.
Yeah, you never knew which version of the Celtics you were going to get on any given night. And not only in the playoffs, but even in the regular season. And it was so frustrating that, they were like that because you'd come in. I was like, okay, which version of the Celtics are we going to get tonight? Are we going to get the team that's dominating and can make shots and can play good defense and actually hone in and play Celtics basketball? Or are we going to get the team that's committing a bunch of turnovers during the game and is just kind of overthinking things and not being able to execute well and then getting beaten by themselves essentially. So it really just was a matter of which Celtics team were we going to get. And that was something that I kept worrying about. And obviously, Tatum and Brown got so much criticism for their performance in the playoffs overall, but especially in that series against Miami, because obviously they're your two superstars, and Celtics Twitter was going crazy about just the lack of productivity overall from those two. And, with Tatum, he wasn't making shots every game, but he was making an impact on the game in other ways, even when he wasn't scoring. And I feel like that's something that fans sometimes tend to overlook or not think about as much because they only look at how many shots they're making, but you can make an impact in other ways without scoring. And I think Horford is an example of somebody who did a lot of that too. Like, he wasn't their best scorer every night, but he impacted the team in other ways.
Yeah, I agree. I think Tatum in the Heat series wasn't terrible. Obviously, he had a bad game three, but everybody had a bad game three.
Yeah.
But I thought other than that, I think he was pretty solid. And then in game seven, it's tough to harp on him too much because he twisted his ankle in the first play. Um, he was a great rebounder. He played solid defense. He was decent playmaker. I think the Philly series is where he really struggled. Obviously, at that, I think 3-4 game stretch where he just didn't score in the first quarter. Picked it up in the last quarter of game 6 and game 7 and won them the series. So a lot of people forgot about it though. But I think Jalen, like you said, was the real issue where it's just if he's not scoring, he's not even just not making an impact. He's kind of hurting the team in a sense. And I've been very critical of Jalen Brown this year. I wrote an article back in December about stuff he needs to improve upon and in like the two tails or two sides of Jalen Brown. And I think what you saw in game 7 is what happens when he is forced to lead the offense almost. Like, I think Jason Tatum is capable of being the one option because he's able to score and he's also able to run the offense. Jalen Brown can score, but he can't run the offense because his handle's not there. Obviously, you saw all the stuff talking about his left hand. That's not there. He can't play make. He doesn't really have the vision. Too often in the first quarter, Jalen Brown's either the best scorer on planet Earth or he's taking 10 shots and missing 9 of them, right? So it's like it's a very flip-flop when it comes to Jalen Brown, and I think the biggest thing for him this season is developing, the consistency to be aware of when he's hot and when he's not and knowing to pass up opportunities, and B, if he can turn into even an average playmaker, and fix his handle, I think that takes the Celtics from, title contender to by far title favorites, and I think that's what Jalen Brown should be working on this summer.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring all of that up with Jalen Brown because obviously there's some mixed opinions from what I've seen at least on Jalen and his place on the team at this point. So obviously, we look at the Celtics and they did have a good season, and winning a championship is hard, but obviously we as Boston fans had high expectations for them since they went to the finals last year, and they pretty much had the same core and the same team for pretty much the most part. Obviously, they added pieces. Like, I think Brogdon was somebody who was huge this year and obviously was great to have on this team. But when you look at the core of players, the question now becomes, is this core capable of winning a championship together? Or do they start to look at other options to fill other needs on the roster and consider moving some people? Like, do you think that they keep Tatum and Brown together and try to just keep the general core of players that they've been rolling with together and just add some pieces around them? Or do you think that they do make some big roster changes to the point where there are going to be some big names that we see that are out the door this offseason?
I don't think they trade Jalen Brown. I mean, you hear Brad Stevens talk about it. You hear Tatum talk about it. Like, it sounds like they really want him back. And I wouldn't be completely against the idea, but I don't think there's a star player out there that it would be worth trading Jalen for. The only two that I come back to, if Embiid became available, I think that would be an eyebrow raiser just because he is very clearly a better player than and Jalen Brown. And that's not a knock. I mean, he just won MVP, like,
Yeah, I mean,
obviously.
I
Um,
think everybody would agree with that.
yeah.
Yeah.
And then the other one that maybe you consider is like if the Raptors would package Siakam and Anunoby, because then you help the depth and you're still getting a star. But at that point, like, would the Raptors just rather blow it up and get a bunch of picks? That seems more likely. I think the more realistic scenario for the summer is you mentioned Brogdon. I think he's probably the first one to get traded. I think he had a good regular season, but I think in the postseason he proved while he might not be necessarily the best fit, because I think when you traded for Brogdon, a big reason was you need somebody who can create their own shot and play make for others. And when you got to the postseason, obviously the injury hurt him and it hurt his shot. But if he wasn't shooting well, he didn't really have an impact. I mean, he played 7 minutes in game 7 and he was a minus 17. Like,
Yeah.
the injury
Yeah.
hurts, but like, you got to be able to have an impact other than your shot. And a lot of the times when he had the ball in his hands, he was only looking for his own shot. He missed a million lobs to Robert Williams. That was one of my biggest frustrations throughout the
Yep.
postseason. So, and especially when you have Marcus Smart and Derek White, who had a phenomenal season for himself, I think you can take Brogdon and trade him for a forward or like a 4-5 that can play some center minutes behind Horford and Rob. And I think that's where you start. If you're Brad Stevens, I think you see, okay, who would want Malcolm Brogdon? How can we trade him? Maybe, shed a little salary because that new CBA is going to kick in and you have to extend Grant Williams and or Jaylen Brown, even though Grant Williams is a question mark too. And I think you start with a Brogdon trade and see what you get. And then if that doesn't work, or if you think you need more, I think Smart and Rob are probably the next two you look at, just because they've been together the longest. They probably have the most value without giving up too much in your current core, because you'd still have Horford, you'd still have Derek White, you'd still have the Jays, and then you go from there. But I think Brogdon is the first piece you look at as maybe the sort of first domino to fall in potential trades outside of Pritchard. Obviously, I'm talking like the core 8
Yeah,
guys.
because obviously Pritchard's somebody who wasn't as,
Mhm.
as big for the team as it is. Like, he was just somebody who more was, came off the bench and
Yeah.
sometimes would make some shots for us, but he wasn't really anybody who, like, you would look at as like he's crucial to making a playoff run. So yeah, I see what you
Mhm.
mean. Like, Brogdon, obviously, like, sixth man of the year, which I do think was very well deserved based on the regular season that he had with the Celtics. But yeah, when it came to the postseason, he was a concern and he was an issue because I kept saying we need more from him. And so Brad Stevens, I really like a lot of what he's done so far in his current role with the Celtics. I think from a front office standpoint, he seems to really understand a lot of the types of players that might work here. And so I really like him in that role. And obviously, I think he has really, really strong basketball IQ. So I think he'll be able to look at the situation and be like, okay, who's somebody that we can afford to move that won't dig too deep into what we have, because obviously you have the overreactionary fans who are going to say get rid of everybody and start from scratch. But this
Yeah.
team is not. You can't do that. This team is not at the point now where you should just blow everything up and get
Yeah.
rid of everybody, because like we know that they have the talent, and
Mhm.
like they still are very much like this core overall is still young. So it's like you can't really give up on everybody now and just kind of start over. But I do think that there are a couple key pieces that we see maybe that end up getting moved. I know another interesting situation is Marcus Smart, because I thought showed a lot of improvement this season in general. I think he's kind of come a long way from where he was at before in terms of being able to be a true reliable point guard. Um but it would be interesting to kind of see if the Celtics value him in that way and see him as somebody like we need in order to be able to make a championship run with this core or not.
Yeah, I've always been a big Marcus Smart guy. I do think Derek White's emergence as sort of this, not star, but like a very good role playing point guard makes him
I'm a big
more
fan of him.
expendable. Yeah, Derek White's been awesome this season. Probably the third best player in the team overall behind the Jays. And so I think from that perspective, you look at Marcus and say, okay, if we can get something that maybe fits this team better, depending on the value, then you go ahead and consider options. The concern for me is I wonder if the Celtics value Marcus Smart more than other teams do, as in, would they be able to get anything more valuable than Marcus back in a deal? I mean, if you're looking at a bigger trade where if you're taking Marcus as a piece and Rob and you're combining them and getting somebody, maybe I can't think of any names off the top of my head, but like a star that could feature in that starting lineup next to the Jays a little bit better, and you can slide Derek White into the one. I think that's something you consider, just because if you look at the perspective of this team has been together for this many years and it hasn't worked, you're probably not getting rid of the Jays. The next logical piece to consider trading would be Smart. So I think from that idea, it makes sense. I just don't know what the value would be. It's hard for me to picture, like, obviously he was a defensive player of the year 2 seasons ago. His
Right.
defense slipped a little this past season. His 3-point shot was actually a little bit better, but they took the ball out of his hands more because they had Derek White and Malcolm Brogdon as more featured roles. Is there a team out there that sees Marcus Smart as their starting point guard? Maybe. But then the question just becomes, what are they willing to give up for him? Because if it's, a draft picks package, that doesn't really help the Celtics. So you need to find sort of the perfect situation where you can get a good quality role player back in return for him. And that's, I think, where it gets tricky.
Yeah, I think Brad Stevens is going to look at a lot of different scenarios. I think there's quite a few players that are on the team right now that he at least looks into just to see what he possibly could get for some of these guys. I think Tatum and Brown primarily are probably unmovable. I think he probably wants to keep those two together. But other than that, there's nobody that I'm looking at right now on this current team and saying, I think that person is 100% unmovable. And
Mm-hmm.
there's no chance that he even looks into a trade scenario for those players. The only players that I'm looking at are definitely Tatum and obviously I think most likely Brown too, unless like you said, some sort of big trade could happen where it's like a face value, like they get a bona fide superstar in return to, just move him, then possibly, but I still am not really sold that Brad Stevens would really fully want to entertain that.
Yeah, I agree. At this point, I think anything has to be on the table outside of those two. And like you said, like only Brown if a superstar is available. But right now, it seems like the Celtics want him back.
Yeah. Do you think, that Tatum and Brown together is a good combination and a combo that can really lead your team to a championship? Because there were question marks earlier on in the playoffs about whether Tatum is a true number one, because in the postseason and there were situations, and I think not just this year but last year too, and there have been multiple situations in the playoffs where people question whether that pressure of being the number one guy is too much for him. And I don't think Jalen can be a number one either. But do you feel like Tatum is capable of being that guy? And do you think those two are that glue that that you can confidently look at as the 1-2 punch? Like if we have these two at the top, we can win a championship.
I do. And I think a lot of the conversation around that sort of stuff is no one's ever going to believe somebody can be the number one until they do it, right? Like no one thought Jokic could be the number one until it happened this year. No one thought Giannis could do. There were talks about Giannis not being good enough to lead him
Which
until he
is
did it. And
crazy.
so, right. In hindsight, it's wild. And so I do think Tatum is good enough to do that. I think all it's going to take is them learning that consistency and them locking in for a long enough period of time. And the fact that that's even the question is probably an issue in and of itself. But I think this summer it's all about Jalen working on his handle slash playmaking, and Tatum just continuing to improve upon the things he's already doing. I mean, he's a top 10 player in the NBA. It's hard to ask for much more than that as a number one. And outside of that, I think it's about putting the right pieces around them. And this is something,
Yeah.
I mean, that's been said like year in and year out, like just put the right pieces around them. It's tough to know what that is. I personally think it is getting another forward so you can have a little bit better depth at that position, and then either trusting Marcus Smart to be the full-time point guard, because I do think they put the ball in the Jays' hands a little too much and just force them to create it for themselves. I'd love to see them run more plays for JT, more plays for JB, rather than just say, okay, go get a bucket. And then maybe you look at like an extra big man, because I do think the load on Al Horford's going to become a bit too much. And especially with Robert Williams' injury history, like I think getting an extra big man or a forward, or ideally somebody that can do both, would probably be the best course of action. And maybe that's trading Brogdon, or maybe that's trading Smart if you have to, like figuring it out in that sense. But I really just think it's about continuing to get the experience, Jalen improving as the playmaker slash ball handler, and Tatum just continuing to improve his game overall. Also getting his jump shot back, because he had a pretty rough 3-point shooting year.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you did mention this name here, Horford. Obviously he's somebody who I love having around the team from a leadership and veteran standpoint, and his experience and being able to even, I know they were talking about how he would kind of act as another coach when Missoula was elsewhere, like he was kind of rallying the team, like we have to finish this out, like we can do this, like we can come back in this game. Like he was kind of that motivational guy that was kind of almost serving as like a player coach, which I love about him because obviously, like we talked about before, a lot of these guys are still young that are in this core group of players, and Al just has been around, like he knows what that pressure is like, and he is personality wise great to have around the team. But it is interesting to me to think about how much longer he's even really going to do this, because obviously his career is winding down and getting to that point. So I think that is something in the shorter term that they do need to eventually think about, because he might be just at some point soon deciding to, like, hey, I'm done, like, and hanging up the cleats too.
Yeah, I think, like you said, from a leadership perspective, he's super important to this team, and I think he's on a really good contract. They inked him to a 2-year, $20 million deal, so he's only going to be making $10 million for the next 2 seasons. But I do think there's going to be a time where they have to bring in another big man to sort of replace him. I think personally, that's why I think it's really important they bring back Grant Williams. I'm a big Grant Williams guy, and he's not the perfect, like, he's not going to play full-time center for you, but if you get Rob healthy, he can guard some of those bigger guys. And I think with the lack of forward slash big man depth the Celtics have, he slots in really nicely as a depth piece. And I know he got a lot of flack for his play late in the season, but then you see this report from The
And the
Athletic
money
coming
he
out.
was asking for too,
I
though.
know, I know. Before the season, I think I saw he was only asking for 14 mil a season, and the Celtics back down. And realistically, I think he gets more than that this summer. I think the Pacers are in on him. I think some other teams around the league are in on him. So I think he could get, if I had to predict, I'd probably say he'll get anywhere from 16 to 18, and the Celtics would have to match that, which sounds like a lot, but with the new CBA, it's really not going to be a terrible deal, in my opinion. But I think he got a lot of flack for his play late in the season, but then you see the reports coming out that Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown went to Joe Mazzulla and say, play Grant more, and he played him, right? And I mean, you look at his play in the postseason, it wasn't perfect, but he made an impact. And he hustled and he tried, and that effort was there. And for a team where we're talking about the effort being an issue, having somebody like that on the roster, I think, is all the more important. And the way I think it plays out, and I said this on our last podcast too, I think if purely for money reasons, because the new CBA is coming in and it's going to be very tight budget wise, I think if the Celtics trade Brogdon for extra depth, then they keep Grant. But I think if they keep Brogdon and go a different route, I think there's a real chance that they just don't match the contract for Grant, because it gets to for that. That's just a lot of big contracts to have on the books.
Yeah, I think like you said, there's a lot of Celtics fans who I don't think would be too upset to see Grant go. I think, he is somebody who really still, to me, hasn't proved himself fully enough that he can be super reliable for this team, because he is very inconsistent, and like he have times where he was huge for this team, and he did have some big games where it was pretty much all Grant. But then there's other times when I'm like, why is this guy still here? So like it really is a matter of what do they see him in the
Mm.
long term being. And I do agree with you. I think there are teams who definitely appreciate his talent, and he will end up somewhere on a pretty good contract. It's just a matter of who will want to commit to that, and where will he fit into what they're doing. So I think it, like you said, is going to have to do with some of the other moves that the Celtics make in terms of what they want the roster to look like. But if Brogdon does stay, yeah, it's going to be hard for them, I feel like, to logically explain handing out that type of contract to somebody like Grant Williams. But I think from a depth standpoint, they definitely do need a little bit more of that. And one of the other things that was frustrating to me too was they were getting dominated on the boards quite a bit. And that's something that I think needs to be addressed too, from like, a size standpoint, and just having people who can go and grab those rebounds, because obviously you have players like Rob in there, but we mentioned his injury history already. And that's where prioritizing a forward or a center, to me, is something that's so important, to be able to have somebody in there that can, and on the offensive end, especially too, because it was a lot of, they'd get one shot off and couldn't get the rebound and get a second chance at it. And you could see other teams that were doing that well. And I feel like that's something that the Celtics were lacking too.
Yeah, the rebounding was a big problem throughout the playoffs. I think a big part of that could be just Robert Williams being, I mean, fingers crossed, more healthy next season. You saw he's coming off 2 knee surgeries this year. Like he played 30 minutes the year they went to the championship, and then he played 23 this year. And then in the playoffs, he played just 21 minutes. And so I think a big part of that is if they can get Rob healthy, they'll have that answer on the boards and at the center position. But I don't necessarily know if they can like plan for that. Like I do think they need backup options. They need a backup big who they can bring in and replace Rob. And who that is the question. I haven't really like dug into potential replacement options because it's probably gonna have to be through a trade. But like without naming names, like if you trade Brogdon for, you know, a center making 10 mil and a forward making 10 mil, right? Like the salary would work and you could get depth. I don't know if there's that around the league. That's just like purely from the perspective of trading one piece for depth pieces in a different area. I think that could maybe work, but again, it's all about finding the right situation and the right time for a trade. And that's, I mean, we say it all the time on our show. I don't envy Brad Stevens. He's got a difficult job.
Yeah, he really, really does. Being in that type of position is tough, and that's why so many people are not in that position. And that's why I'm always like, we have to just trust him and trust what he's doing because he
Yeah.
obviously sees, you know, the vision for what he wants this team to look like and how they should be building a championship team. So I would not want to be the person who's making all these moves and have people being like, "Why would you do that?" or like, "What was he thinking when he did this?" So that aspect is tough. And then another thing that I did want to address too and get your thoughts on is coaching because you know, I am going to come out and say I think that Missoula got way too much heat for um everything. I think, you know, he made a lot of mistakes in the playoffs all the way up through game 3 of the Heat series. And I do think we started to see some changes from him after that game in terms of just timeout management, in particular, rotating guys, and just the way he was executing different things. And it to me, it just, they did look different. And he seemed to learn a lot of things along the way. But the reason I say that I think he got too much heat is because he's a first year head coach. And I think it shouldn't really be a surprise to people that there were those bumps in the road with him being the head coach. And, you know, when you commit to a rookie head coach, people have to know to expect some of those types of things to happen. And obviously, after the whole Ime situation, when they brought him in, you know, as an interim head coach, and then they were having a good season, and they made him a permanent head coach. I felt like there could be some issues with that because I was like, obviously, coaching is super important when you want to win a championship. And I do think coaching is something that held them back a little bit because you look at somebody like Spoelstra, who is so accomplished, you know, the best coach in the league right now, probably, and just is so accomplished and has been doing this for so long and has been in this situation multiple times. And you compare him to a first year head coach like Missoula, and from a coaching comparison, it's not really even close to me. And so obviously there were people saying after the playoffs they should get rid of him and bring in a veteran head coach to work with these players if they want to be a championship caliber team. Which, you know, I understand why people were saying that, but I do think a lot of this, people were disregarding the fact that it was his first year as a head coach, and there are things that he still has to learn from that standpoint. And my whole thing was, if they wanted to win a championship this past year and they were worried about that, then they should have looked into a veteran head coach at that point that had the experience, unless they really, really trusted him and what he could do. So I do want to hear your thoughts on that whole situation. Obviously, they're keeping him. I mean, they're fixing
Yeah.
the coaching staff. They're bringing him some more help and more experience on the coaching staff. They've already brought a couple people in with him already so far since the offseason started. So what are your thoughts on him as a coach and their approach with what they've been doing to the coaching staff so far this offseason?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely frustrating. I mean, by the end of the postseason, you were kind of getting to the point where, like, okay, like he's got to find a way to improve now. Like, I was very defensive, like for Missoula, as in, like, I also don't think he got a fair, chance, especially because you look at the situation he was put in. A lot of people saying, "Oh, why didn't you get this coach?" Well, the Celtics didn't exactly have a ton of time to decide who their next head coach was. They weren't planning on having a new head coach, and so
The whole thing was
it's just
a
yeah,
unique
like
situation.
they didn't really have a lot of time, and not only that, but then Joe Mazzulla was put in this super awkward, very tough situation where he had to jump in, just like a week before training camp and take a hold of this team that had finals aspirations. And a big part of that was Tatum wanted him. The team, knew him. He'd been there since the Brad Stevens years, and so he's familiar with the team. He made mistakes throughout the season. The timeouts thing was obviously a big deal. I thought the bigger problem at times was his rotations, leaving Grant out, not putting in Hauser for extra shooting, playing 3 guards in the first game of the Heat series. Like, there were some things I necessarily didn't agree with. But like you said, they've added Charles Lee, who's one of the top assistants, Sam Cassell, another one of the top assistants. Both have gotten head coaching interviews in the past few seasons, so they're very clearly experienced. Sam Cassell played in the league too, so that sort of replaces the Damon Stoudemire role, because he left in the middle of season 2, which doesn't get talked about. So Joe Mazzulla didn't have a full coaching staff around him for the majority of the season. Then Damon Stoudemire left, and now they're going to have a chance to sort of reshape everything around him. It's kind of like when I'm trying to think, like think of when Sabonis got traded to the Kings last year. Like, they didn't make a playoff run because they didn't have time to figure it out. Obviously, it's a little bit different because the whole thing was in place, but you look what happens when you build a year of chemistry, and the Kings are in the playoffs again. So you give Mazzulla a full offseason, a full everything, a full year to get used to this team, because he did genuinely have to jump right in, and I think he'll be a lot better,
Literally.
especially with the changes. Yeah, so I'm with you. I think Mazzulla will be fine.
Yeah, literally though, was had to just jump right in. Didn't really have much time to prep at all for what he was going into. And I think now that he got all this exposure to them making a pretty deep playoff run and getting all the way to the Eastern Conference Finals with him coaching, that alone is good experience for him that he can kind of take into this offseason. And he now has been able to see a full season of these players with him, facilitating everything. And so I think from a comfortability standpoint for the players too, like obviously the players need to adjust to a coach just as much as the coach is adjusting to the players. And
Definitely.
it's a big, like there's so much that goes into that. And I think from a player standpoint, now that they've had a year understanding his coaching style, that can only move upwards from here for me. I do think going into next season, things will look a lot cleaner in terms of his decision making and his rotations and knowing kind of when to put guys in, when to put people on the bench, and just understanding more about how this Celtics team operates and the role of each individual player that he has to work with. Because I think that was something that was a big problem for him this year. But I really kept saying to people, I truly feel like it's a time and lack of experience thing right now. I don't think it's a matter of he's just a bad coach that can't get the job done. Obviously, us as fans, like when we're upset, people will overreact about things too and be like, he sucks, like he couldn't get the job done. I would understand that criticism if he had been with the Celtics for 10 years and this all took place.
Hmm.
I'd be like, yeah, 100%. I don't think he's the answer. Like, let's look for somebody else to right the ship here. But I really think more time is what's going to do it. Because I think from a basketball standpoint, I think he's a really smart basketball guy. And I think he really understands how the game works. And I think he can connect with the players, which I think is also super important. So I really do think, I think there were people, because there's these reports, people saying the players didn't respect him. I don't buy into any of that. I think that's just clickbait, them just trying to, get their clicks on their stories and whatever it is from the media. I don't think that's an issue. And I think, going forward, I think we are going to start to see growth from him. And like you said, with these assistants that they've brought in, it seems like they really wanted to prioritize getting him guys around him that can really, really help out, that are experienced. And that's exactly what he's getting here, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And like you said, you saw a lot of improvement just in those last 4 games of the Heat series. And so I think you give him a whole offseason going into next year, he'll be a lot better, especially with the help.
Yeah. No, for sure. It's definitely frustrating. I mean, I totally understand people's frustration. I was frustrated myself at just the way that season ended. I mean, they looked that, that game 3 against Miami, I was like, what is going on with this team. Like, they legitimately just look like they don't want to be here. Like, they really were coming across like they were putting in no effort in game 3. And that was heartbreaking to watch as a fan. And it's, you have all of those emotions when the team gets eliminated. And obviously for Celtics fans, it's like, oh, come on, like we have to deal with this like heartbreak and disappointment again of our team not being able to get the job done. So I do think, you know, Joe Mazzulla is going to be one of the pieces that makes a difference next year. I think that's one of the biggest things, actually, to me, that's going to make this team, where they were this year to being able to be a genuine championship caliber team next year. And I do think that his coaching and the adjustments he's able to make in this offseason is going to make more of a difference than people will, you know, talk about or give credit to, because I do think that's, the coaching is a huge part of them not getting all the way back to the finals again, and it's more about experience.
I agree. Yeah, I think coaches get all the blame and none of the credit usually. Like they're always the first one to get the blame, always the first one to get fired, and then
You
when
suck.
everything's going right, yeah, when everything's going right, it's the players though. And so I think it's unfair, and I do think Missoula will be better. And I mean, you look at all the problems, and Missoula's getting all the flack for. The Celtics have had the same problems for the past 3 years with 3 different head coaches. So like, some people are just so honed in on always blaming the coach that I think Missoula was always going to get a lot of the blame. But I do think he'll be better, like you said.
Yeah, no, for sure. And obviously the Eastern Conference is good. They were in a tough conference this year. I always said, if the Celtics are able to get out of the Eastern Conference, I really feel like they can win the whole thing. Obviously that didn't happen. But they are just as talented, if not more talented right now than a lot of those other teams on paper in the East. It's just a matter of being able to figure out how to properly utilize everybody and bring in the right pieces to surround the Jays, like you said. And that's where I think we see this offseason. We do see changes. I don't think they're going to come out, with the same roster that they had. And I do think people get moved. It's just really a matter of who Brad Stevens prioritizes and sees as like, okay, this person is definitely a crucial piece of the puzzle. Like, I can't get rid of him if we want to win the whole thing.
Yeah, and I think that's the toughest part because like you have these 3 great guards, you have obviously the Jays, you have these 2 great big men, then you have depth, and it's on paper this was one of the best teams in the league this year, and so you really hoped it would have worked because now you have the tough choice of like if you get this player and then this part of the game, like if you get rid of Brogdon, your 3-point shooting dips off, that's a problem. If you get rid of Rob and your defense dips off, that's a problem. So Brad Stevens really has to pick and choose what he wants to prioritize. That's probably defense. You heard a lot of the players talking about, okay, we need to be defense first again. Maybe you want to see them go back to the double bigs, or maybe you move Horford to the bench because he's getting up there, and you find another big to pair with Rob that can space the floor. It's all about, like you said, utilizing the talent to the best of their ability, and it's going to be a long off season for Brad.
Yep, 100%. I mean, I'm sending prayers to Brad Stevens because
Yeah,
this is not an easy thing that he's going to have to deal with. But it's going to be just a fun summer to just see what happens and what he does decide to do. But I still have faith in the process and what they're trying to do, and I do feel like they are talented enough. It's just a matter of being able to go out and execute that, and I think that, hopefully they will.
I agree. They definitely have the talent. They just got to put it all together and not be consistently inconsistent. That's the problem.
So frustrating. But I really do appreciate you hopping on here and chatting some Celtics with me. I always love talking with other people who are just as passionate about it as I am. So I really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, of course, anytime. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
No problem. Yeah, before we wrap up here, can you just let everybody know where they can find you on social media and find your content?
Yeah, I'm writing for Celtics Blog for Celtics content. You can find me on Twitter at Jack Simone NBA. And like you said, I do host a Celtics podcast as well. It's called How About Them Celtics. Twitter handles at How About Them C's, and we're on YouTube as well. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I definitely recommend everybody to check it out. Follow him on Twitter. He's super knowledgeable about basketball. If you're looking for somebody to give really good analysis about the moves being made this offseason, he definitely would be a good source for that. So hope you all check out his content. Jack, I appreciate you coming on again. I hope you have a fantastic weekend. Everybody, as always, thanks for tuning into the show. Appreciate all of you and your support constantly. Hope you all enjoy your weekend as well. And I will catch you all next time. Take care, everyone.